All right, everybody, welcome back to yet another attempt at distinguishing good from bad science. Another bad science example. We have researchers who claim Google searches for suicide, the word suicide, increase when bills banning men from women's showers are proposed. Yeah, today's post is why this is silly. Now, modern science, medical science anyway, has seemed to settle on this idea. If a man who pretends to be a woman is denied use of the ladies' shower or restroom, he will feel bad about himself and perhaps kill himself. Now, thus, we ought to let him in the showers with the women and mandate the ladies inside go along with the man's delusion. Now, this idea is, of course, also so if we swap male and female on that little scenario, but it's tiresome to speak or write that way, so I'm only going to use the male delusion as an exemplar. Now, it's a separate question how mandating delusion-agreement came to be the preferred treatment for delusion. It's like, as many people say, mandating liposuction for anorexics, or, as I say, mandating free flights to Epstein Island for pedophiles. Here we're interested in the idea that proposing non-agreement will cause suicides in the delusional. So let's talk about this paper. It's a peer-reviewed paper, The Wonders of Peer Review, entitled Anti-Transgender Rights, Legislation, and Internet Searches Pertaining to Depression and Suicide by George Cunningham and others in PLOS One. There's a link on the blog. It's freely available. Anybody can read this paper. The authors open by reminding us that the delusional, quote, report more attempted suicides than do their peers, end quote. Now, the direction of that statistic is, of course, nowhere in dispute, and it surely cannot be a surprise. But keep in mind the modifier attempted, reported more attempted suicides. And ask yourself this question. Would a delusional man acting out by pretending in public to be a woman and becoming upset when others do not concede his delusion possibly also act out by attempting suicide? That is, by going through the form alone as an attention-seeking device? Of course, it's also true that delusional will more often kill themselves than the non-delusional, which again cannot be a surprise. But if you were this delusional if you were this delusional man reading about, say, a proposed legislation to ban men from women's showers, and you wanted to act out with a suicide attempt to gain attention, how would you do it? Our authors suppose you jump onto Google and search for suicide, the word suicide, and that therefore searches for suicide at times when legislation are being discussed must therefore be caused by the mental agonies of the delusional. Yes, this is what they say. Here's a quote from their paper, the introduction or thereabouts. Quote, the purpose of this study was to examine whether debating anti-transgender rights legislation among state legislators is associated with increased suicide-related internet searches. Well, I'll pass by their use of the word rights and all these kinds of things. Note carefully, though, that this is really about discussions of reality-based legislation. The author's own table of these bills list 40 such bills introduced in different states from July 2019 to July 2020, but only 2 were ever passed. In Idaho, which, according to one official source, had a higher rate of suicides in 2017 and 2018 than in 2019, and that 2018 was a peak. Indeed, 2019 saw a large drop. The 2 states with the highest number of proposed reality bills were Missouri and Tennessee with 8 bills each. Well, it turns out suicides in Missouri dropped in 2019 and 2020 from a high in 2018. Tennessee did see a slight uptick in suicides from 2018 in 2019 and then to 2020. But Mississippi, the next state down on the list with 4 proposed bills, had a constant rate of suicides from 2017 with a small drop in 2020. Alabama, 3 proposed bills, steady drop in suicides from the peak of 2017. There were 5 states with 2 proposed bills. Colorado, steady to slight drop in suicides from 2018. Florida, a steady fall from 2018. Idaho, which we discussed. New Hampshire, a steady large drop from the peak in 2018. And Ohio, with a slow but steady drop from the peak in 2018. There were 7 states with only 1 proposed bill. Arizona, California, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, South Dakota, and Utah all had drops from a peak in 2017 or 2018, except Kentucky, where 2020 was equal to 2018, but 2019 was lower. The only state they list with no proposed bills was New York, which also had a small drop in suicides from 2018. Therefore, a statistical analysis as naive as our authors reveals proposed reality-based legislation causes decreases in suicide. Am I right? If they're right, I'm right. Now, in contrast, here are the author's own goals. As they say, quote, research question number 1. Is there a relationship between the introduction of anti-transgender bills and Google searches for suicide or depression? The words suicide or depression. Research question 2. Is there a relationship between the passage of anti-transgender bills and Google searches for suicide or depression? Okay, we've already seen there was no increases in suicides. About depression, I don't know. I don't even know how to check, so I didn't. And there was only 1 state that passed legislation, Idaho, and that suicides fell there from an earlier high. So their theses are on shaky ground already because suicides went down. But here's what they did in order to prove to themselves, anyway, that their theses were correct. They gathered state-level Google weekly searches for the word suicide and depression too, in which they handled the same way, but I'm not going to discuss it. It's exactly the same. Like this. I'm going to quote now. This is their description. To develop our dependent variable, we first collected the weekly volume of searches for suicide. Following this, we then normalized this measure by using the values produced by 2 additional searches, one for the common search term weather, and another using the combination of both the keyword and common search term suicide and weather, as has been done by prior scholars. Following this, we then normalized the measure of Google searches for suicides for each week in every market by using the following equation. Well, you have to look at the equation online. It's suicide, the normalized measure, equals suicide minus this quantity, weather minus the quantity suicide plus weather, which if you work it all out equals 1 equals 2, or suicide equals 2 weather, or something like this. So there's something else is going on here. Now, if they only meant suicide and weather, people who type in searches for suicide and weather simultaneously, maybe like someone searches, does suicide increase in bad weather? There's not going to be a lot of those, and you think there's going to be a lot of searches for weather for the obvious reasons. And if you subtract from weather the number of searches that said suicide and weather together somewhere, it's going to leave a number pretty close to the plain number of weather searches. And since the number of weather searches is going to be a lot bigger than suicide searches, we're going to be left with a lot of negative numbers. So that doesn't make any sense, especially since they took the logarithm of this derived measure. And none of it made sense. I couldn't figure out how they normalized this kind of a thing. So all I did was look. I went to Google Trends like they did, and I looked it up. So I have a plot on the blog for the 3 search terms. You can compare them all. There's suicide, the number of times suicide was searched. It looks like about a weekly or monthly or something like this level. And weather, separately weather, and then the term suicide and weather. So searches where suicide and weather together were mentioned, like in the example I gave, does suicide increase in bad weather? Something like this. Now, of which there were none. There were no searches for that, at least in Idaho, that had the two terms together, searches and weather, over the last 5 years. Over the last 5 years, not just in their 1 year period, but over the last 5 years, none. But there were tons of weather searches, and there was a reasonable amount of suicide searches. So it's not clear to me at all how they did this. Now, they could have meant searches which were suicide or weather. But for Idaho, since there were no suicide and weather searches, suicide or weather should necessarily be suicide searches plus the weather searches. So that if it were true, what would their equation give? Again, they end up proving that 1 equals 2. Literally, you can work through the math. I have it on the blog. You can go and look. It's absurd. But if they meant suicide and weather, then we would have the ridiculous equation that suicide, the derived measure, is suicide minus weather, which again is everywhere negative. It doesn't make any sense. I can't figure out what they have done. So what I did was I went back to Google Trends and I looked at weather, and I just searching for the word weather, and then contrasted that by weather and suicide, not just or suicide. Now, these two plots, since there's no searches for suicide and weather, but there are lots for suicide or weather, you think these things would kind of overlap each other, but they don't. Sometimes weather and suicide's a little higher, which means all it means is Google has a slight quirk in the way they count these things. I'm sure there's all kind of niceties to the Google algorithm that counts these things and stores them for the number of, searches for exact terms and all these kinds of things. And when you start adding in ands and ors and everything, you're going to get subtle ambiguities and everything. The two curves match almost exactly, but not precisely exactly. And so that if you were to do differencing or normalizing on these numbers, you're going to get something that's screwy and not really interesting. And anyway, even if I'm wrong about how they normalized their counts, weather searches went up or stayed pretty much steady, which you can free to check. There's a link on the blog. And suicide searches went down, as I'm going to demonstrate. So suicide searches went down almost everywhere. So their entire premise is false. It's entirely false. And you could look just at the Idaho suicide searches, and you could look just at the period they give you, or the last 5 years. Suicide searches go down. They just go down. They go down from July 2019 to July 2020 on average. Well, what about other states like Tennessee and Missouri, which had the highest number of proposed bills? Both same. Down, down, down for both Tennessee and Missouri from July 2019 to July 2020. Down, down, down. It's the same with Mississippi and Alabama. It's the same. I checked every one of these states. It was a boring task, but I checked every state on their list, and all of them went down except Ohio, of course, the rogue state of Ohio, which remained steady. Didn't increase, didn't decrease. So weather searches went up, and suicide searches went down. So any kind of normalization would show suicide searches going down even more. So it's nuts. The whole thing is nuts. Clever readers will note, though, that I'm only talking about 1 year periods in here, and the authors collected weekly data, which might show increases in searches at the exact times when legislation is introduced or voted on. But even our authors reject this simple analysis. Quote, they say, because legislation can often take many weeks for a bill to be introduced, considered, and then voted on by a legislature, we develop a time trend variable to measure how long bills have been introduced and considered by each state government. End quote. Well, that's rational. At least that part's rational. But accepting that, once again, using the naive analysis style of our authors, introducing these bills, since all of the suicide searches went down, must mean that introducing these bills causes fewer Google suicide searches. Oh, they were only going to... Anyway, I'll skip that and we'll just jump this. They put their curious numbers, whatever they are, and I can't reproduce them, so I'm not quite sure what they are, but they put those curious numbers into a regression model. And I have a picture of that regression model on the blog. And if you don't understand these things, well, it's difficult to explain. The left-hand term is the log of this quirky number. All right. And then they have others. And I'll let you, if you go on the blog, you can stare at it. But they have this. This is a quote, we created a trend variable, bill trend. The number of weeks that transgender bills have been under consideration. Additionally, we also include the square of this trend variable so as to consider whether any potentially impact of that's their word. Any potentially impact of the trend may be increasing or decreasing over time. Now, there's no warrant to do this over this time period. It leads to overfitting, and with the trends we saw, it could explain everything. Because we already saw them going up and down. But never mind. The real flaw, if I read it right, is the two other variables I have in there. Passed and failed. These are indicator variables, passed and failed. If the bill passed, it didn't fail. And if it failed, it didn't pass. So they're the same variable. This maneuver thus adds numerical instability, which can cause the results they got. Positive coefficient on passed, which is the results they got is a positive coefficient on passed, even if everything else in the model is all right, which it isn't. So it's just like putting male equals 1 or 0 into the model and also introducing a variable female 1 or 0. One variable is a one-to-one function of the other. You'll still get answers from the regressions, but they'll be bad ones. So the rest of the model is just as wild. A bill being introduced, they have an indicator for bills being introduced, gives a negative coefficient. Yet to pass a bill, you necessarily have to introduce it. And so did the moving the bill to committee variable get a negative coefficient. None of that makes the least sense. It would mean introducing legislation caused suicide searches to decrease. And next, bringing the bill to committee caused suicide searches, again, to decrease. And they only increased when the bills passed. Which doesn't make sense because that only happened twice. And we saw in Idaho. And we saw that suicide searches decreased there, even as weather searches increased. This paper is a mess, start to finish. There's nothing to justify most of the moves the authors made, especially when trends in suicides themselves were down in most places, and searches for suicides were down everywhere, except in Ohio, which again is a well-known troublesome state. I'm from Michigan, so I'm allowed to say this. They had to rely on quirky statistics and a flawed model to come to their conclusion. And even if all was well here, which it wasn't, there's no indication anywhere that people doing suicide searches were delusional men or women, specifically or only. It could have been people depressed about losing their jobs over corona doom lockdowns or whatever. Nevertheless, even given all these major contraindications of their base idea, that their base idea was false, our authors say, we grounded the study in stigma theory. Oh, God, they go on and on about stigma theory. Ah, yes, sweet theory. The rescuer of bad science everywhere, as regular listeners know. They claim they showed that the, quote, the passage of anti-transgender bills is linked with internet searches related to depression and suicide. Linked, as we all know, is the word used when authors want to use cause, but don't dare. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, everybody.